Hi, it's Pastor Andy with our Wednesday discipleship video this week. And in the last few verses of our passage this week, we see Paul talking about his ministry to the Gentiles. And specifically, he uses the word that he is boasting about it. Now, when he speaks of boasting, he's not boasting in his own achievements. He's already said that that is something we shouldn't do. Right here in Romans, we see that in Romans 3:7, again in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. But Paul's boasting is about what he is able to do because of the grace of God. Now, in a pre-COVID world, many of us really didn't think a whole lot about the challenges of travel. Now, you may not travel much, or maybe you travel or traveled a lot, but pre-COVID, maybe you didn't like to get on a plane, but okay, I'll get on a plane because I want to go see so-and-so, or I want to take a vacation, whatever. Maybe you have a preference for being the driver or the passenger in an automobile, but for the most part, we're going somewhere. Not a big deal about travel. Well, as COVID began, those concerns cropped up in many, many different ways as far as even when I get to my destination, it's not so much about the travel, but do I even want to go to the destination? Because when I get there, there might be challenges. And maybe there could be challenges on the way to that destination. Well, the ease of travel is something that is new. I mean, in the first century, this wasn't the case at all. There were thieves, there were bandits, there were people that were along the side of the road for a very intentional reason. And what might be a 10 to 15 minute drive for us to another town or whatever to go to the store, maybe 15 to 30 minutes, whatever it might be, but even a 10 to 15 minute drive for us could be an all-day affair for those who were back living in the first century, because that, say, 15 miles that we could go in 15 minutes would take several hours to walk, especially if you were caravanning with others, which you would do for safety. When you got there, this might be your only trip for the week or the month, and therefore you are gathering many goods in the market. In one market that would have maybe clothing or cloth or fabric to make clothing, whatever it was, all these different things. And so then another, few hours to walk back to your home. And of course, this is why those robbers and bandits were robbers and bandits were along the roadside, was because if there were people coming to the market or walking towards the market, they had money, and on the way home they had goods. So either way, if you're a bandit, you could accost somebody and perhaps take care of your own situation without all the hassle that all these other people were going through. But by the grace of God, Paul was chosen to travel. And he was chosen to travel a lot. We know of 3 different missionary journeys that are in the Bible. And if you have a Bible that has maps, and most do, you can actually look through the different journeys that Paul took during his time. Here in this passage this week, in verse 19, he talks about having traveled from Jerusalem to Illyricum. Now, Illyricum doesn't exist today in that form. It was the former state or nation, if you will, of Yugoslavia, but that larger statehood has been shrunk down now to include a little bit of Yugoslavia, but Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, etc. It's all these more smaller countries. And it's basically just opposite the channel of Italy. And so that's where it's located today. But he says that he has fulfilled my ministry of the gospel of Christ in this. So does that mean that Paul went everywhere from Jerusalem to Illyricum? Well, not that he talked to every person in every town, but what Paul did do, and the reason he could boast, was because he had set up a center of ministry in so many different towns, such as Corinth and Ephesus and Thessalonica, etc. And now he was hoping to do the same in Rome, because his ultimate goal, as we'll see in next week's passage, was to get to Spain. And so Paul, again, had not talked to everyone, but he had set up a hub of ministry. We see that almost exact word used in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul says, I had hoped to use this as a launching place so that I could reach these other places from Corinth. He wants to do the same thing from Rome. But first, again, we'll see this next week, but first, as a part of his ministry to the Gentiles, they have been giving money to the church back at Jerusalem. And so Paul is taking those donations back to Jerusalem with the expectation that now when I get back to Jerusalem, I will turn around and I will come to Rome to see you. Well, that would be another journey. And of course, we have part of the record of that journey in the book of Acts, because Paul did make it to Rome. But he didn't make it to Rome as he had planned. Paul had a goal to go back to Jerusalem and then to get to Rome, and that was God's goal as well. But Paul's goal did not include being imprisoned. And yet it was because he was imprisoned that he got to go to Rome after stopping off at a few different places along the way and petitioning, sharing about Jesus to governors, to government officials, and ultimately appealing to Caesar himself and then standing before Caesar at that time. All of this, we can see, was not just a part of Paul's plan, but it was also a part of God's plan. At the end of this week's passage, we have in verse 21, Paul says, "But as it is written," very common for Paul to quote from the Old Testament, "but as it is written, those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand." And you say, well, where's that passage from? Is that in the Old Testament? Yes, it's from Isaiah chapter 52. And actually, it's a part of the same passage. We normally start Isaiah chapter 53 with the suffering servant talking about Jesus. And, by his stripes we are healed. And he was led as a lamb to slaughter. And all of that comes from Isaiah chapter 53. But really, the few verses just preceding that, including this quote that Paul has pulled here, is a part of that same suffering servant. And of course, we know that the suffering servant was Jesus. But really, Paul was kind of a suffering servant. He wasn't the suffering servant, but God had asked him to do things, to go to a new group, to a new people, the Gentiles. And he had done that from Jerusalem to Illyricum. Now he was going all the way to Rome. And then eventually he wanted to go to Spain. We don't know if he ever got to Spain. Scripture doesn't tell us that. But what we do know is that having established churches throughout the western part of the Roman Empire, he now wanted to do that same thing in the eastern part of the empire, with Spain being mentioned specifically. Rome was an important part of that strategy, and he did intend to get there, and he did, again, after his arrest when he arrived back in Jerusalem. So Paul had plans. Those plans were fulfilled, even if they were not fulfilled in the way that he expected them to be. And that's why Paul could boast. Because Paul made plans, and I'm sure many of the plans that Paul made, he was able to do, he was able to accomplish. But as Proverbs 16 reminds us, man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. And so for us, may we have a similar attitude to Paul in that when we make plans, whether our plans are fulfilled the way we think, whether they are not fulfilled because we see God doing something different, or whether they are fulfilled because God has changed the way our plans are carried out. In all of our circumstances, let us be thankful to God, boasting in God for what He has done in our life, rather than boasting about ourselves.